Okay, welcome back. This lecture is designed to dive really in depth into the heart and cardiac components and mainly the cardiac cycle. It may seem really in depth for this class, which it's kind of pushing that edge. It's geared, and the information would be more appropriate maybe for an exercise physiology class, with the exception of the heart is an important organ, obviously. And a lot of you are probably going to become EMTs if you're not already, and are going to be on a track to become a paramedic. And you're going to need to know this stuff anyway, so I thought it's a really good opportunity to give it to you now. And that way you really have the understanding of what's going on with the heart. We're going to talk in some later lectures about, cardiac disease and, one of the #1 killers of firefighters in the line of duty, and it's a heart attack. We'll talk about some of those statistics. So I think it's really important for you guys to have the physiology that goes into the heart so that you really understand why it's important. Lifting's great and doing all this stuff for lifting and being strong is great, but if you don't have a strong heart, doesn't mean anything. It's all kind of bupkis, for lack of a better term. So if you had to pick anything, I've emphasized this again, cardiovascular fitness is the most important. So we're going to talk very specifically about that now. So I hope you enjoy it. Now, most of these things we've already talked about in the previous lectures. I want to just go through really quick on a couple of slides, review them. But cardiac tissue, we touched when we talked about muscle tissue, or the musculoskeletal system, and I believe that was in section 2. Don't quote me on that for sure, but anyway, so it's multinucleated, it's interarticulated discs, but the big thing we really hammered on was that serial versus parallel pattern and how we exercise it. We got into Carbonian formula and how it can stack cells end on end and become more efficient at stroke volume. Or we talked about how a weightlifter, builds parallel stacking side to side. So we'll get into this maybe even a little bit further in the future if we have time. But I think we've hammered that point home pretty good. And again, here's just another quick picture showing these two different things. So it can replicate in a serial pattern where it stacks end on end, or in a parallel pattern where it stacks side by side. Again, here's just another slide showing microscopically that branching and the ability to replicate or regrow and hypertrophy, and we'll talk about hypertrophy here in a minute, either side by side in a parallel fashion or serial and stacking end on end. So some of the major cardiovascular functions are obviously it's delivering of oxygen and other nutrients, and it's removal of carbon dioxide and other metabolic waste. If you remember back to our 3 energy systems, we have phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate system, glycolysis, and then we have aerobic fitness, which is cardiovascular fitness, and that's the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. So we can see that it's important to deliver oxygen and remove carbon dioxide, which is our byproduct. Carbon dioxide, again, is our byproduct of aerobic metabolism, or aka the Krebs cycle, sometimes referred to as the citric acid cycle. So the cool thing is, again, when we build that carbon dioxide up, we just increase our respiration rate and get rid of it. It transports hormones, and we have all different types, but one of the main ones that you see a lot in emergency calls is diabetes. So it's going to be responsible for transporting insulin in case you have a diabetic coma going on, or glucagon if you have someone that is, hopefully you got it by now, hypoglycemic, which means low blood sugar. One of the drugs we give is glucagon, which brings blood sugar up. And so it's a misconception a lot of times in those that are had an EMT class or working maybe on their paramedics class. Someone that's diabetic most often is found in a state of hypoglycemia. And that might be the exception for someone that just ate a meal. Obviously, they can be more in a diabetic coma. But the traditional person that's been out hiking all day, exercising all day, and hasn't had anything to eat, even though they're diabetic and they might be even type 1 diabetic, doesn't necessarily mean that we should give insulin. In fact, it's most often that we shouldn't. We should give glucagon because they had, maybe insulin in the morning at breakfast. It brought them down to normal levels, and then they haven't had anything to eat all day. So typically the way we treat diabetes in an emergency reaction is we give sugar. And so the blood is responsible for transporting glucagon and insulin and all those other things that we see normally. It does thermoregulation, both hot and cold. So if we're hyperthermic, meaning our core temperature's up, it's going to rush blood to the surface of the skin so we can have evaporation and cooling. If we're hypothermic and our core temperature is too low, when we start to shiver and the muscles warm the blood up, it's going to transport that to the other organs and areas to warm it up. Helps maintain an acid-base balance in the overall body through the fluids, and it has a huge immune function. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the heart, all right? And we're going to go in depth. We'll probably come back to this picture here in just a minute. We're going to go in depth of how blood flow moves throughout the heart, all right? So you can see this is a great picture, kind of labeling. We have, you know, the tricuspid valve here, the superior vena cava from the body. This is all the blood flow back to the heart. We have the right and left pulmonary arteries going to the lungs, the aorta, so forth and so on. So we're going to go through here in just a minute of how all this works and how all this contraction takes place. All right. So I want to show you a little video about the cardiac cycle, and then I'll come back and, for lack of a better term, kind of take you through in my own language.
Ventricular contraction causes the atrioventricular valves to close, which signals the beginning of ventricular systole. The semilunar valves were closed during the previous diastole and remain closed during this period. Continued ventricular contraction increases pressure in the ventricles above the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary trunk, causing the semilunar valves to open. When the ventricles relax and their pressures drop, blood flowing back toward the relaxed ventricles causes the semilunar valves to close, which is the beginning of ventricular diastole. Note that the atrioventricular valves remain closed. When the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the atrioventricular valves open and blood flows into the relaxed ventricles. This accounts for most of the ventricular filling. The atria then contract and complete the ventricular filling.
All right, if we break this down a little bit simpler terms and kind of put it into terms that I want you to know, this is a really good flow chart of what's going on. All right. Again, the superior vena cava, all right, and the inferior vena cava are basically these giant veins returning from the body's system. All right. So as everything comes up from the lower body and everything comes back from the upper body, they come through these two giant veins right here. All right. They're going to come together and they're going to dump into the right atrium. All right. So as the right atrium is relaxed, all right, their body is pushing blood flow back into that. Now, one of the things I want to talk about here is in the way in which we return venous flow, all right, vein flow and all the blood that's just sitting out in the veins is through muscle contraction, or a large part of it. So when we squeeze our bicep, when we squeeze our tricep, when we get up in the morning and we stretch and contract all these muscles, all right, and do all these things, when we do that, muscles are pushing on all these veins and promoting blood flow in the vein. And what happens is we have these little valves in the vein that kind of sit like this, if you look at my arrow down here. So they're one way. So when we squeeze, the blood returns this way and then it gets trapped and it can only go one direction. All right, so by stretching and doing muscle movement and contraction, we are highly encouraging blood flow back to the heart. So again, it comes in through these vena cavas, the superior and inferior, comes back, dumps into the right atrium. All right, and the right atrium and left atrium contract at the exact same time. And we'll get into contraction here in just a minute. So let's go through the flow. So it goes from there, it dumps through the tricuspid valve, all right, dumps into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it gets forced through the semilunar or the pulmonary semilunar valve, which we see here, and it's going to go into, all right, the pulmonary arteries, all right. And so the pulmonary artery is the only artery that has non-oxygenated blood in it in the entire human body. All right, this is going to go to both the left and right lungs. All right, it's going to go through the lungs. The blood cells are going to get oxygenated. All right, they're going to dump carbon dioxide here and pick up oxygen. It's going to return back through the left and right pulmonary veins, excuse me. All right, so we have these left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins that we see here. This is a mislabel, it's up here. All right, so right pulmonary veins here and left pulmonary veins. Those are both going to come together and dump into the left atrium. All right. From there, the left atrium, it's going to come down through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's going to get pumped through the aortic semilunar valve and dump into the aorta. And at that point, it goes out to the rest of the body. Right? It goes to the trunks and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to go that far, but I want you to be able to know this cardiac cycle. All right, and if you kind of follow this flow chart on the right, you'll have a pretty good understanding. All right, and that's how it works. And again, the ventricles are contracting at the same time, and the atriums are contracting at the same time. And we'll go through that here in just a minute. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about how the heart circulates blood throughout itself into the atriums and the ventricles and the valves and all that, let's talk a little bit more specifically about how it conducts. All right, so we have a couple of things that are going to help with conduction. We have the SA node, which is the sinoatrial node. We have the AV node, which is the atrioventricular node. All right, we have the AV bundle and the Purkinje fibers. So these are the four kind of features or structures that are going to help the heart or the cardiac system to conduct an electrical impulse. All right, so we're going to come back to this slide here in just a minute, but I wanted to show you real briefly. Here's the SA node, the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the AV bundles, and then the Purkinje fibers coming out, infiltrating throughout the entire heart. All right. Before I go here, what I want to do is talk about this real quick. All right. Cardiac tissue has a very unique ability. It can generate its own electrical signal, and what we call that is spontaneous rhythmicity. All right. And what that means is, without any input from the nervous system, the heart tissue has the ability to electrically, conduct a signal. All right, and the way we found this out is if we take a heart transplant patient and we take that heart, if we don't hook up that AV or that SA node, the heart will naturally increase its rate at about an operating system of 100 beats per minute. All right, it does not require any nervous input, nor does it require any hormonal input, and the average heart rate that associated is about 100 beats per minute. All right, we'll come back to this and see how this is going to change when we involve hormones and like the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All right, but let's back up now and talk about how this electrical system happens.
Action potentials originate in the sinoatrial node and travel across the wall of the atrium from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node. Action potentials pass slowly through the atrioventricular node to give the atria time to contract. They then pass rapidly along the atrioventricular bundle, which extends from the atrioventricular node through the fibrous skeleton into the interventricular septum. The atrioventricular bundle divides into right and left bundle branches, and action potentials descend rapidly to the apex of each ventricle along the bundle branches. Action potentials are carried by the Purkinje fibers from the bundle branches to the ventricular walls. The rapid conduction from the atrioventricular bundle to the ends of the Purkinje fibers allows the ventricular muscle cells to contract in unison, providing a strong contraction.
Okay, so we're going to dig a little bit more into this here in just a minute, but to simplify it down a little bit, if I back this video up a little bit, what we can see is we have the sinoatrial node, all right? So a nerve's going to come down and cause this guy to depolarize. And when that happens is you can see the impulse is going to spread across the right atrium. In addition, it's going to come across and infiltrate the left atrium as well. And so both the right and left atrium are going to conduct and contract simultaneously. All right. Then this is going to hit at some point the AV node. All right. Once it hits the AV node, it's going to travel down. All right, coming along the atrioventricular bundle, and it's going to come all the way down, split, and it's going to hit these Purkinje fibers. When it does that, it's going to cause both the right and left ventricles to contract at the same time. All right, so we have the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. And that's kind of what I want you to know. We're going to dive a little bit more in depth here in just a minute. So you can see boom, boom, boom. Hopefully I slowed that down enough so you can see SA node to AV node to Purkinje fibers, and we get that contraction going on. All right, let me just back this up. I'm going to actually edit the audio and just show it for you so it shows it a little bit smoother. So hopefully you get a good understanding of that. All right, let's go ahead and pick up where we left off here now. So we covered this. Come on, slide. All right. So heart rate. Cardiac tissue, again, we've talked about this. Spontaneous rhythmicity doesn't require any electrical input from the nervous system. It can create a rhythm on its own at about an average of 100 beats per minute. All right. Now, there are three external factors that will control heart rate. All right. So if we don't have any of these external factors, we don't have the parasympathetic division, sympathetic, or endocrine system, the heart theoretically would beat at about 100 beats per minute. But we do. We have these other features. So we have the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and we have hormones. So let's talk about the parasympathetic first. All right. This is when the vagus nerve, now the vagus nerve is part of our cranial nerves, all right, and it's one of the nerves that's going to come down and feed the heart. All right, it's part of the parasympathetic division, which is the kind of rest division. It's in charge of respiration rate, heart rate, and all these when we're at rest. All right, not when we're under stressful environments. That's the sympathetic that we'll talk about here in a minute. All right, is in place of firing the heart rate. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to slow the heart rate down because acetylcholine, which is one of those neurotransmitters, is being released. All right, the maximum amount of vagal stimulation that we can induce to the heart will decrease the heart rate about 20 to 30 beats per minute. All right, so when we're at rest and we're not having these types of fight or flight types of responses, when we're just kind of relaxing and we're not doing anything cardiovascularly challenging, the parasympathetic nerve starts to innervate and takes over the SA node, and it will decrease our heart rate. And the average heart rate for an adult is about 60 to 80. So if you noticed, when none of this stuff's happening, our heart rate's at about 100. But when we are at rest and we're not having forces put on our body, our heart rate is much lower than that because the parasympathetic division is taking over. All right? When the opposite of that happens, when our sympathetic division takes over, all right, and we have the sympathetic system taking over, like things of fight or flight or maximal effort, all right, the heart rate will raise up to almost 250 beats per minute. Now, 250 is extreme, all right. More than likely, it's going to be a 180 to 200, somewhere in that range, all right, or that range. In addition to raising the heart rate, it also causes a more forceful contraction of the ventricles. So we're not only elevating the rate at which we're contracting, but we're making sure that we're getting a maximal effort of contraction as well. And then the last one that can be an extrinsic factor is the endocrine system and hormones. All right. The third extrinsic way in which the heart rate can be affected is through the endocrine system, and we release two different types of hormones here. All right. These hormones are classified as catecholamines, and they are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so when these guys get secreted, they're going to release our or they're going to increase our heart rate, excuse me, all right? Again, when either of these two catecholamines are released, the heart's contractility factors increase, becomes more susceptible for depolarization, all right? And these hormones are either driven by this are driven by the sympathetic nervous system. We see huge influxes in epinephrine and norepinephrine when the body is exposed to high-stress environments such as fight or flight. So what this all means in relationship to heart rate and wrapping it up related to fitness and all those kinds of things, the more conditioned an individual is, the more the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge. And it has a depressant type of factor on the heart's electrical system, which really in the long run means lowering that resting heart rate. We've talked already about the importance of that and how the more conditioned you are, the more you train cardiovascularly, the more efficient the heart gets at stroke rate volume. The parasympathetic nervous system ties directly into that. It's been observed in marathon runners, a resting heart rate as low as 28 beats per minute has been observed in world-class marathon runners. That's ridiculously low. And if you've had an EMT class and if you've had a paramedic class, you know that someone with a resting heart rate of 28 typically in an average scheme of things means that they do not have much longer to live. They're either in severe hypothermia or some other major kind of catastrophic incidents going on, and we need to treat them like as soon as possible and get them aid, otherwise they're not going to make it. The more we train, the more that resting heart rate comes down. So a resting heart rate in an extremely trained individual is an okay thing. My experience with Division I cross-country runners, typically the resting heart rate is between 40 and 50 beats per minute, which is still extremely low, but that's getting closer to that normal 60 to 80. the big emphasis I really want to hammer again on cardiovascular training and endurance and all that is that we really need to train our heart. We got to use that Carvonen formula, 3 to 5 times a week, 20 to 30 minutes, working at our target heart rate of a 65 to 80% workload to really stress the heart so that it will replicate in a serial pattern, train this parasympathetic nervous system, electrical system, and lower the resting heart rate and make our heart much more functional and make the stroke volume much larger. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about the types of electrical waves that we get and how we measure these things. So we're going to talk about an electrocardiogram, commonly called an ECG or an EKG. All right, and some of us may have had EKGs or ECGs run our lifetime. I know I've had one just as a baseline for my physician. And so you might have heard of like a PQRST wave or so forth and so on. All right, so I'm going to show you this and we'll come back, and again I'll put it kind of into my own terms here in just a minute.
The heart is a beating muscle that pumps oxygen and nutrient-rich blood throughout the body. Each beat is stimulated by electrical signals that pass through the heart muscle or myocardium. In order to examine the function of the heart, a doctor may perform a test called an electrocardiogram or ECG, also referred to as an EKG. During this test, electrodes are placed on the chest and recordings are then made of the heart's electrical signals. Sometimes the electrodes are also placed on the arms and legs. The electrical signals follow a set pathway through the heart, beginning at a spot called the SA node, which is located in the top right chamber or atrium. The signal then branches out through both the right and left atria, which contract and push blood into the lower chambers or ventricles. The electrical signal also passes into the ventricles via the AV node and then travels down the tissue that separates these two lower chambers. Finally, the signal travels back up the ventricles, which contract and pump blood to the lungs and body. Variations from the normal electrical pattern may indicate damage to the heart due to a heart attack or heart disease. Often a patient will be required to perform a stress test during an ECG. A stress test usually involves walking or running on a treadmill at progressively increasing intensities while recording an ECG. This test allows the doctor to examine the heart's electrical activity during the stress of exercise.
Let's put this into my own terms now, and what I really want you guys to know. So if we look here, we have the sinoatrial node here. This P wave, all right, if we see that we have a PQRST wave, all right, the P wave here is representing depolarization and electrical impulse for both atriums, all right, that's coming from the sinus atrium node, all right, so it's depolarizing, sending out its electrical current to both atriums, all right. The QRS complex, all right, is this phase of activation of the ventricles, all right, depolarization and contraction of the ventricles. Now, sometimes the Q and the S gets lost. The R will always be the peak of the QRS complex, all right? But depending upon if you're using a 6 lead, a 12 lead, the individual heart rate, we might not be able to see this little depolarization dip at Q and S intervals, all right? But you should always be able to see this R spike because, again, that is the ventricle spike for depolarization and contraction, all right? The T wave is described as repolarization of the ventricles. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what about the repolarization of the atrium? And what's happening here is the repolarization of the atriums is taking place simultaneously when the ventricles are depolarizing. But because the ventricles are so much stronger, they mask the repolarization of the atriums, all right? So we kind of lose that feature on an EKG or an ECG, all right? So again, P, atrial atrial contraction, depolarization. QRS complex is ventricle depolarization and contraction, and then T is repolarization of the ventricles, all right? Over here on the right, what you can see is you can see a normal heart rate. We have this PQRST, PQRST. Each beat, all right, each contraction or beat of the heart represents one PQRST complex. All right. Then we have a fast heartbeat, which is sometimes called tachycardia, slow heartbeat, bradycardia, and then this is just a whole arrhythmia. And we'll go through some of these arrhythmias here in just a minute. Again, if you want to see another one, it kind of breaks it up: PQRST, atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, and then ventricular repolarization. All right. And again, you can see multiple PQRST, PQRST. This is a normal sinus rhythm or heart rate. All right. So let's get a little bit into blood pressure, and then we'll come back to some of these arrhythmias. Most of us have had a blood pressure taken or have taken a blood pressure at some point in time in our life. All right. When we take a blood pressure, what we're doing is we're measuring two different pressures, and we're measuring that in millimeters of mercury. All right, we're measuring a diastole and a systole. All right, and our typical numbers are like 120/80. We do this using a sphygmomanometer, which is just a really fancy term for a blood pressure cuff. All right. Now, diastole, all right, is the pressure left in the system when all four chambers are no longer contracting, when they're in that rest phase. All right. So it's the amount of pressure that is basically left in the system. All right, and this is usually the smaller number of the two. So if you have the 120/80, this would be the 80. All right, the systole is when the chambers are maximally exerting forces onto the blood system, or the capillaries and the arteries and the vessels. All right, this is typically represented when the ventricles are in full contraction mode and the pressure they are exerting out onto the system. All right, here we can see a sphygmomanometer placed over the brachial artery, and again, normal should be 120/80. And you can kind of look at this chart. We have no sound; it's totally closed. That's when the blood pressure cuff is pumped up to about 200. As we slowly let the pressure off, the first sound that we hear should be somewhere around 120, and that's the systole. That's the amount of pressure it's squeezing out maximal force through the system. And then the last little beat that we hear typically is the diastole, and that's the remaining pressure in the system. All right, so I wanted to show you some quick heart sounds, so bear with me just a moment and I'll play some of these. Okay, here is a normal heartbeat. Here is now an abnormal heartbeat, which would be like a murmur. And then this last one would be like a mitral valve prolapse, which is not very common, but a common heart murmur. Notice when you hear this one, you almost hear like a backflow of kind of swooshing in the background of that, like valve almost collapsing on itself. I'll play it again. And that's resulting because that tricuspid and bicuspid valve that we talked about earlier are not fully closing, and they're kind of, the flaps are either folding back on themselves, or the blood is literally passing back through the valve and it's not fully closing off. Anyone that has like a mitral valve prolapse or a murmur, like when they have dental work and stuff, a lot of times have to take an antibiotic because it's really common for bacteria to get trapped behind that valve and cause an infection. Let's talk a little bit more about cardiac arrhythmias now. Some things that we see commonly, I shouldn't say commonly, but some things that we see, one might be bradycardia. And bradycardia means slower. What that means is our heartbeat is slower than 60 beats per minute. And when I mean slower than 60 beats, I'm not talking about when we're exercising or when we're doing things like that. This is for someone with a resting heart rate lower than 60 beats per minute. Now, again, an athlete, someone that's in very good physical condition, their heart rate might be lower because that's normal for them. But a typical standard person that doesn't exercise a lot, especially endurance and things, is probably not going to have a resting heart rate of that low, or they shouldn't. Then we have one called tachycardia, and tachy means fast. So this is a person with a resting heart rate, not during exercise or exertion, but a resting heart rate faster than 100 beats per minute. Again, this is based on a resting heart rate, not when exerting yourself. So I'm going to play you a little video clip of tachycardia. This may be what tachycardia sounds like on a monitor. And this is a heart rate, if you look up here, based on 186 beats per minute. So that person's heart is working extremely fast. Now, someone in exercise like me, if I was doing a maximal exertion, full on sprint, my heart rate might shoot up to 186, which is normal. But for someone that's at rest, this is not a normal feature. The next cardiac arrhythmia is called premature ventricular contractions, commonly called PVCs. All right, and this is when the heart is either skipping a beat, it has an extra beat within its rhythmic pattern. So you might be like bump, bump, ba bump, 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 ba bump, or it might be bump, 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 those kinds of things. All right, this is a really bad type of arrhythmia to have because it usually indicates someone's going in to a cardiac arrest. They're having a heart attack, or it's right before they're having a heart attack. So PVCs on a monitor are not good. And if we look at this next slide down here in a minute, I'll show you what PVCs look like. All right. Two other additional cardiac arrhythmias are ventricular tachycardia, which 3 or more consecutive PVCs are shown. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a minute.
The heart usually beats about 60 to 100 beats per minute. With each beat, your heart pushes blood throughout your body. The upper chambers, the atria, contract at the same time. Then the lower chambers, the ventricles, contract at the same time. When a tachycardia starts in the heart's lower chambers or ventricles, it's called ventricular tachycardia. Ventricular tachycardia is a heartbeat greater than 100 times per minute. This fast heartbeat doesn't allow enough time for the ventricles to fill with blood between beats. So less blood and oxygen is pumped to the body and, most importantly, to the brain. Sometimes ventricular tachycardia stops on its own after a few seconds. Other times, the fast rhythm continues, or worse, progresses to a faster and more dangerous rhythm called ventricular fibrillation.
So now I want to show ventricular fibrillation, which is when tachycardia can turn into if we're not careful.
The heart usually beats about 60 to 100 beats per minute. With each beat, your heart pushes blood throughout your body. The upper chambers, the atria, contract at the same time. Then the lower chambers, the ventricles, contract at the same time. Ventricular fibrillation often starts with a fast rhythm in the lower chambers of your heart called ventricular tachycardia. It is caused by a problem in your heart's electrical system. Ventricular fibrillation is a very fast rhythm in which your heart beats 200 to 300 times per minute.
What's really happening is the ventricles are literally just kind of quivering in place. There's no type of continuity in the impulse at all, and they're just different cells are firing at different times, and literally this thing is just kind of quivering there. And with both really bad tachycardia and fibrillation, the ventricles really never relax long enough to fill with blood, so even if we were to get a contraction, they're not pushing any blood flow out. So I wanted to show you what those PVCs look like, all right? At the top up here, we can see a normal PQRST complex, all right? So we have this whole section right here is indicating one beat, and another beat. And again, we have that normal P, QR, and S complex, and then the T wave. So P, QRS, and T. Right, down here, if we come in, this is a PVC. This is an abnormal arrhythmia, all right? And you can see we have an attempt at that PQRST, PQRST, and then all of a sudden, bloop, we got a little dip, PQRST, PQRST, bloop, another dip, another like Q kind of R type of thing going on. This is an abnormal sinus rhythm or an arrhythmia. Not good. This person is either in cardiac arrest or very, very soon to go into cardiac arrest. All right. This is just a slide showing you heart rate. We have, just ranges of a pulse. Heart rate is known as a pulse. So we have a newborn is about 140 to 160. An adult 60 to 100, so forth and so on. And then this last thing that I wanted to cover, which is kind of cool, I had never seen this chart until I looked in our text. I knew about it, but I've never seen it laid out this neatly, so I thought I'd throw it in here. This is the blood volume distributed, or cardiac output distributed, during heavy exercise and rest. So everything in blue is rest. You can see that 20 to 25% of our cardiac output is going to digestion. When we're at heavy exercise, only about 3 to 5% is going there. So the majority of our blood volume, or our cardiac output, is delivering blood to the muscle during heavy exercise. So I just thought that was just kind of a cool chart. So This is the end of the presentation. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me, and I hope that you guys got a lot of information out of this.